In the movie Darkest Hour, set during the Dunkirk operation, a scene shows Winston Churchill calling Franklin Roosevelt to request destroyers and fighter planes. However, Roosevelt refuses due to the United States' neutral status. Instead, Roosevelt suggests sending horses to the fighting British through Canada. The fictional conversation reflects the essence of the negotiations between the two political figures who historically corresponded in writing. The states really did not want to become a party to the conflict. Great Britain would receive its first aid only 4 months after the evacuation of British forces from France. As for Ukraine, the American Congress will allocate the first aid package 2 days after the start of Russia's full-scale invasion. It will be delivered 2 days later. The risks for the United States were even higher than at the start of World War II. Military supplies were already being delivered before February 24th. And this is explained not so much by determination as by the realization of the consequences of indecision. That's why it's extremely important for ordinary Americans to understand the essence of the Russian-Ukrainian war and which side is right. In this regard, Zelensky's interview with the popular American conservative commentator Ben Shapiro, who has 7 million subscribers, is very timely. Because it influences that part of the audience that, let's say, is skeptical about helping Kyiv. And yet, despite the well-placed emphasis in the interview and the right message in the comments that Shapiro made after the interview, I would like to add to some of the author's points, which, by the way, best demonstrate the reason for the misunderstanding of the Russian-Ukrainian war among Republicans in the United States of America.
What are the main conclusions I drew from the interview with President Zelenskyy? Did I get answers to all the questions in the way I wanted? I can't say that the answers to all the questions fully satisfied me. I don't know where every dollar from the United States of America goes in Ukraine. I don't know if all my questions were answered regarding, let's say, election issues in Ukraine or corruption problems in Ukraine. When it comes to the United States and our allies, one of the greatest failures of American foreign policy in the last 80 years since the end of World War II is the strange conviction of the United States of America that if our allies are not perfect, then it makes sense to abandon them. That's exactly what we did in Vietnam. Our allies were imperfect, so we abandoned them. And then the Viet Cong came to power. The situation in Afghanistan was similar. Our allies were flawed, with terrible people in the Northern Alliance and Afghan government and rampant corruption. However, the opposition turned out to be far worse.
The very comparison of the United States' withdrawal from Vietnam and Afghanistan with helping Ukraine demonstrates a misunderstanding of what's happening. But first, about the money. Ben Shapiro couldn't find out where every dollar of American taxpayers' money went in Ukraine. Telling Ben about the 2024 partial audit by the United States Department of Defense Inspector General that found no major issues is likely unnecessary. It's pointless to mention this because the audit was conducted under Biden and Shapiro is a Republican. Well, okay, but we can calculate the effectiveness of the funds spent. What do I mean by that? The Vietnam War cost the United States $111 billion. Adjusted for inflation, that's about $1 trillion today. The war in Afghanistan required even more, $2.3 trillion. All financial and military support for Ukraine cost the United States $182 billion. As they say, compare the results. These are not just investments in a foreign war, but in our own security. In the United States National Defense Strategy, Russia is considered a serious threat to the country. Therefore, comparing wars in which American troops participated and a war where the defending side has at least halved the military power of the country that poses a threat to America and did so for such a small amount of money is simply wrong, essentially. That's about the financial aspect, which Trump is very concerned about. Politically, comparing Afghanistan, Vietnam, and Ukraine is fundamentally wrong. In Vietnam, Washington supported President Ngo Dinh Diem, a man who appointed either his brothers or relatives to all leadership positions. A man who received $28.5 billion from American taxpayers, which in today's money is more than $260 billion, comparable to all the aid provided to Ukraine. At the same time, Ngo Dinh Diem never managed to create an army capable of standing up to North Vietnam on equal terms, which is why America had to send its own military personnel. Ukraine, on the other hand, which held free and open elections in 2019, managed to build an army that not only stopped the world's second largest army, but also inflicted a series of painful defeats on it, all without receiving significant subsidies from the United States before the full-scale invasion. Well, I think it's simply inappropriate to draw parallels between the government of Ukraine and the government of Ashraf Ghani, which cost the American Treasury $110 billion in today's money and fled Kabul before a single Talib had even entered the city. But this is not so much a criticism of Shapiro as it is an important addition. This is the context that would allow the average American to look at the war in Ukraine through the right lens. In all other respects, Shapiro got to the root of the problem.
To grasp Putin's message, one must thoroughly examine the writings of his chief ideologue, Alexander Dugin, often referred to as Putin's brain. I spent quite a bit of time studying Dugin's works because you can't understand your geopolitical enemies until you've studied them. There is no doubt that Dugin opposes the United States of America.
Of course, the claim that Alexander Dugin is Putin's brain is debatable. The ideas of Eurasianism, Russia's unique path, and Russia as a God-governed country have been expressed by various philosophers, including Ivan Ilyin, frequently quoted by Putin. But it's very good that Dugin is getting attention. I'll explain why. Alexander Gelevich is one of those who managed to formulate that very imperial chauvinist idea that Russian dictators are guided by. And it's absolutely right that Shapiro sees the root cause of Putin's actions, not in the desire to oppose NATO, not in the desire to get rich by seizing more rare earth metals, and not in the desire to protect the Russian language and culture. No, Putin is about something else. He sees a messianic mission in his actions, which Dugin was able to describe. The Russian dictator is rebuilding an empire, and everyone in his way will either be enslaved or destroyed. Ben seems to have begun to grasp this concept as his way of expressing things has changed. But that's not so important anymore. What matters is what he's saying now.
What exactly does Russia need to fulfill its messianic mission? Dugin advocates for the destruction of NATO, which he claims represents the American mission of Atlantism in its purest form. He insists NATO must be destroyed. He says that Moscow's task is to remove Europe from under the control of the United States of America and NATO.
Yes, once again, you can't even imagine how important it is that Ben Shapiro voices these thoughts to an American audience. I assure you that the softening of the White House administration's rhetoric towards Ukraine is, among other things, thanks to Ben. But here's why it's also important. I've already told you before that among the leading American political scientists such as John Mearsheimer, Stephen Walt, George Friedman, or even Jeffrey Sachs, the mainstream version is that Putin was, let's say, provoked. All of them either implicitly or explicitly claim that by expanding NATO eastward, the West was trying to contain Russia. All these renowned political scientists use equivocations. They say that, of course, the United States government will never admit it, but it's obvious to everyone that the very essence of the alliance has always been to counter Russia. Some Russian liberals agree with them, condemning the war in Ukraine while at the same time sharing Putin's concerns that the expansion of the alliance threatened the security of the Russian Federation. It's true that a military alliance nearing a country's borders can be seen as unfriendly. However, there's one thing to consider.
When it started to spread, it was the Baltic states who were the first to remember this. Then everyone started saying, wait, we are a sovereign state, we joined the Union, we can sort things out within the Union.
And as a counteraction
to this, there in the Central Committee and in the Committee for State Security, the idea was born that it was necessary to stir up the autonomous republics in order to confront them with a fait accompli. Especially, for example, the Georgians, that you want to leave the Soviet Union and then Abkhazia or South Ossetia will separate from you. And the same goes for Transnistria and so on. And this was artificially created.
Yes, the revelation of the first Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation, Andrei Kozyrev, is an open secret. Of course, right after the collapse of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, Russian special services began to artificially fuel separatist movements on the outskirts of the Soviet Union. You can trace this work simply by taking as an example a random employee of the Committee for State Security in those years. Here is Vladimir Ante-Yufeyev, now the first Deputy Prime Minister of the unrecognized Donetsk People's Republic. He initially participated with the Riga Special Purpose Mobile Unit to prevent Lithuania's secession from the Union. After the failure, Ante-Yufeyev was sent to Transnistria in 1991. There he took the top position in the local Ministry of State Security and oversaw the local separatists, proving to be more successful. The same scheme with different Russian intelligence officers was tested in South Ossetia in January 1991 and Abkhazia in August 1991. By that time, the renamed Committee of State Security, now the Ministry of Security, was attempting to manage the First Karabakh War in 1992. So, you see, in the same year that the Soviet Union ceased to exist, Russian intelligence agencies, using the means available at the time, tried to keep the former Soviet republics within the Russian sphere of influence. That's why, in discussions about NATO threatening Russia with its expansion, people forget to mention that the countries that were part of the Warsaw Pact saw Russia as a threat from the very first days after the collapse of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and that's why they sought to protect themselves. Everyone understood that fueling separatism was a temporary measure. It's just that in the 90s, Moscow didn't have enough resources to send troops into the rebellious republics. It temporarily resorts to proxy wars, as seen in the case of Ukraine. Moscow repeatedly created conflicts using a consistent pattern, labeling ruling elites as Nazis, inciting separatists, deploying specialists and volunteers, and then following a familiar script.
Where are you from?
I came from the Urals
What is the purpose of your visit here?
to fight the fascists.
Which fascists?
From the newspapers, I understood that they're called Romanians. Well, not as a nation, but like a name, like what you're called, Romanians.
I pay so much attention to all these issues, friends, because society in the United States of America does not realize the root cause of the war in Ukraine, and therefore does not realize the threats that further expansion by Putin brings. And the fact that such famous conservative speakers as Ben Shapiro are even trying to understand the logic behind Moscow's actions is already a big success. I'm just adding some context, since this video will also be dubbed in English. If anyone is interested, subscribe to my Telegram channel where I'll talk in more detail about the stage of readiness of the English language channel and what the whole idea is about. It should launch soon. But let's get back to Shapiro.
How would you comment on the counter-accusation that Ukraine is actually just a haven of Western decadence? That it's a decaying liberal country that supports all leftist social ideas. That's why conservatives in the United States, for example, don't need to worry about Ukraine, because in reality, Russia is a more religious and conservative country.
Even though Volodymyr Zelenskyy did a good interview with Shapiro, the answer to this particular question, which actually concerned Ben's audience the most, was unfortunately incomplete. Volodymyr Oleksandrovich stated that these topics are not currently significant for Ukrainians. The Ukrainian president likely provided a politically correct response as expected given his position. But if I was sitting across from Shapiro, I wouldn't have held back and would have given a whole lecture on the so-called conservatism in Russia. After all, Putin has really managed through propaganda to convince Western conservatives that modern Russia is a stronghold of Christian values. It's a state that stands against leftist globalist trends, against absurd migration policies, against woke ideas, transgender people, and other concepts of diversity, equity, and inclusion. But the thing is, that's absolutely not true. Russia will become the most liberal country on the planet regarding same-sex unions tomorrow, if tomorrow the United States of America starts persecuting people for non-traditional orientation.
The contest organizers keep warning the Russian duo, no liberties on stage. Will Tatu listen to them?
The contest's reputation is already near collapse before it has even taken place. The conservative Eurovision in Riga will not happen. 48 years after the creation of the European Broadcasting Corporation, this contest won't be the same as before. The group Tatu, two 18-year-old revolutionaries, skillfully guided by producers and technologists, gather the largest press conferences and make parents all over Europe worry about teenage rebellion and madness. Eurovision is urging Tatu to refrain from any shocking acts during their performance.
Of course, I'm exaggerating a little and joking, but only a little. And yes, maybe someone born in the 2000s didn't get it, but this is Russian television being outraged by Eurovision's conservatism for allegedly discriminating against the supposedly lesbian Russian duo Tatu. But seriously, Putin doesn't care what ideology he uses for his main goal, to restore the empire. For example, the Washington Post, having obtained a number of classified documents, discovered a connection between Moscow and political activists in Germany. The leaked data shows that the Kremlin supervised and of course sponsored protest actions by the right-wing party Alternative for Germany and, attention, the left-wing party Die Linke, which translates as the left. Russian political strategists actively worked on bringing the right and left together in Germany to create a powerful movement advocating for cooperation between Berlin and Moscow. As a result, the radicalized wing of the left, led by Sahra Wagenknecht, split from the main party and ran separately in the last Bundestag elections. But fortunately, they didn't make it, as they say, the horseshoe rule. Journalists discovered Moscow's promoted narratives using documents. The demands included lifting sanctions on Russia, starting Nord Stream, and halting aid to Ukraine. I'll leave a link to the investigation in the description, but you get the point. Putin really doesn't care who to cooperate with, left or right. His main goal is to undermine unity in Europe and in individual European Union countries. Source:
A Washington Post security source believes that some protest actions in Germany were indeed initiated by Russian political strategists. For example, the slogans that appeared in intelligence documents obtained from the Kremlin were used at rallies in Leipzig and Neustrelitz. And most interestingly, the Kremlin was probably planning to create a new political movement in Germany. It was planned to reformat the Alternative for Germany party, unite it with left-wing forces, and create a German unity party capable of winning a majority in the elections.
Also, if you remember, I told you how Putin brings migrants into Europe through Russia and Belarus, and at the same time stirs up anti-migrant sentiment in the old world. Honestly, I don't understand how Ben Shapiro can ask questions about right-wing ideas in Russia when the main Kremlin allies in its war have turned out to be two communist regimes, China and North Korea, as well as Iran led by its spiritual leader. Some people might wonder, maybe Putin is actually a leftist and he's not rebuilding an empire, but rather a Soviet-style country. No, once again, he doesn't care who he forms alliances with to achieve his goals, with the left, the right, the back, or the front. The Kremlin regime has never been a champion of not just traditional values, but any values at all. The Putin may call himself a nationalist, but it was through his actions that a privileged class of national minorities was created in Russia, enjoying unlimited rights. I'm talking about the Kadyrovites and Ramzan Kadyrov himself, who is the head of one of the most heavily subsidized regions. At the same time, Kadyrov gets the greatest opportunities when it comes to raiding. The United States of America is outraged that a black person can rob a store and be let go. I'd like to see their reaction if they found out that in Russia a bearded Caucasian man could try to take over the Russian equivalent of Amazon and nothing would happen to him. Once again, Putin is against any ideology that doesn't serve his goals. And the best proof of this fact is this speech by what seems to be the main ideologist of the Kremlin dictator.
There is a treacherous social democratic faction, the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, which is giving up the positions of socialism, the positions of labor, and claims to defend the interests of working people. And this is actually a tragedy.
Alexander Dugin expressed outrage at the Congress of the Labour Russia Communist Party, claiming the Communist Party of the Russian Federation has betrayed the ideals of Leninism-communism. And again, there's nothing surprising about this. It's not even an imitation of political trends. It's just that Putin, Dugin, Xi Jinping, Kim Jong-un, and the Iranian Ayatollah are united not by some ideology or worldview. They are united only by hatred. Hatred towards those to whom they lost, whether it was the Cold War, economic confrontation, or an ideological one. These people are driven by revanchism, and the West needs to understand this as soon as possible, otherwise it will be too late.
A coalition is forming around Russia on the issue of Ukraine. Iranian drones, Chinese soldiers, and North Korean troops have been observed on the battlefield in eastern Ukraine. A coalition is forming during this war, and so when you talk about creating an anti-American coalition, this coalition is forming on the battlefield. Perhaps you would like to comment on this? I've always been surprised that the United States seems to be trying to find an approach to the Russians. I appreciate their desire to end it, but I want to be understood correctly. The Russians will always want and wish for the destruction of the United States as a leader, the destruction of the American economy. Believe me, we were born in the Soviet Union, we were told this in schools. This is the policy of the Soviet Union. This is the policy that Putin is bringing back today.
Yes, and here the Ukrainian president is emphasizing the right points. These are the words that the West does not want to hear. More precisely, they are drowned out the further you get from the borders of the Russian Federation. After all, in the Baltic countries, they understand perfectly well that this is not a confrontation between liberalism and conservatism. It's not a clash of traditional values and neoliberalism. It's not even about geopolitics. After all, from her point of view, it would be beneficial for Russia to trade, become wealthier, develop and use soft power to draw former allied states into its sphere of influence. No, it's much more complex. Putin is driven by a self-defined sense of mission. And people like Alexander Dugin only provided a theoretical foundation for it, generously seasoned with mysticism, religion and conspiracy theories. But the goal of this mission is quite prosaic. It is about enslavement, conquest and destruction. And there is nothing spiritual about it. And if there is, then the warriors of light are definitely fighting in uniforms bearing the blue and yellow flag.
Glory to Ukraine! Glory to Ukraine! The second glory!
While I was writing this video, I came up with this aphorism: in a dictatorship, truth serves power. In a democracy, power must serve the truth. I understand how many objections this might cause you to have. Believe me, I also don't consider this statement to be an unshakable truth. But it's just that when I see how the rhetoric of the White House is changing, how the rhetoric of Trump, who just yesterday was calling Zelenskyy a dictator and was understanding about Russia's missile strikes on residential buildings, is changing, and today Donald is clearly softening his message, I can't help but note the fact that no matter how you look at it, democratic institutions do work. And of course, if journalists, bloggers, publicists, and ordinary citizens of the United States of America weren't raising the issue of the war in Ukraine, old Donald would hardly be changing his approach to Russia and Ukraine in any way. And now it seems like there's a ray of hope appearing. So we keep doing what we have to do. Although, as always, it's up to you to decide whether to be or